Hello and welcome to another lesson in Ivy history. Again, we're going to be talking about the Cold War. This section will address the consolidation of rival blocs in Europe and the initial policies of the Detente in the US and the USSR. It will focus on two major crises: an attack on Egypt by Britain, France, and Israel, and the suppression of the Hungarian Uprising by the USSR. A further crisis began in 1958 when the Soviet Union attempted to force the US and its allies to make concessions regarding Berlin. This crisis ended in 1961 with the construction of the Berlin Wall. The first section of this presentation is the Thaw from 1953 to 1955, and our guiding question is, to what extent did relations between the Soviet and Western blocs improve from 1953 to 55? Please take a screenshot of this diagram. This is how you can arrange your notes. This is how the presentation is structured. So the main points of the Thaw. First, it's going to be the end of the Korean War in 1953. Obviously, we're also going to be accounting the end of the Indochina War in 1954, the Geneva Accords of 1955, and obviously all the issues that we've had with Germany and the division of Germany ever since the end of World War II. General Dwight D. Eisenhower won the presidential election in the U.S. in 1953, and in the USSR, a collective leadership took the place of Stalin after his death. And obviously, we see the picture of Mr. Eisenhower on the left and really death Stalin on the right. Eisenhower spoke of freeing the people under Soviet control. He considered using nuclear weapons in Korea and Indochina and referred to the atomic bomb simply as another weapon in their arsenal. However, he did hold his restrictions. In fear of a bomb in national territory, on November 1st, 1952, the U.S. exploded the first hydrogen bomb in the Pacific Ocean. A year later, the USSR also successfully tested a hydrogen bomb. By the end of 1955, both sides had long-range bombers able to drop these bombs on each other's territory. Even though the US possessed more bombs than the USSR, each superpower was in a position to inflict catastrophic damage on the other. In this situation, Eisenhower saw that the only practical alternative was the peaceful containment of Soviet power in Europe rather than attempting to remove it. In the post-Stalin era, we're going to be seeing the rise of the Khrushchev era. So basically, Nikita Khrushchev, Georgy Malenkov, Vyacheslav Molotov, and Valery Beria also included Nikolai Bulganin. So again, I'm going to just repeat their last names because these are important people who actually formed the post-Stalin government. We're going to have Khrushchev, Malenkov, Molotov, Beria, and Bulganin. These are going to be sharing power for 3 years after Stalin's death. At the same time, they were also political rivals. This group was determined to improve living standards in the USSR and to dismantle the police state created by Stalin. In August 1953, Malenkov declared in the Supreme Soviet that there was no disputed or unresolved question that cannot be settled by mutual agreement of the interested countries. They needed to divert armament funds to actually save the people of the USSR. Set up in 1936 by Stalin, the Soviet Supreme consisted of two bodies, the Soviets of the USSR and the Soviets of nationalities. Each Soviet republic had a Supreme Soviet or parliament, as did the overall USSR. So basically, the Supreme Soviet is going to be this parliamentary structure that each of the countries is going to be having. Obviously, the biggest overarching one is going to be the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. When we're talking about this unit, we need to figure out what the Detente is. The Detente is going to be a state of lessened tensions or growing relaxation between two states. This is why this section is also called a Thaw, because we're looking at this policy of the Detente, this policy of actually engaging with the opposition and trying to find solutions. To improve relationships with the Soviets, the US called for free elections in the West. Britain, on the other hand, called for German reunification and demilitarization, but this proposal was unpopular with the West German Chancellor Adenauer. In early 1953, The Soviet Foreign Office made proposals for German unity, submitting them to the US, Britain, and France. It suggested a provisional government be created of politicians from both German states and the removal of all foreign troops of occupation. So basically, everybody's now calling for a union of Germany, but what we have to understand is we also have these two ideological camps that are going to be fighting for the total control of Germany at the end of the day. As a member of Comecon, the German Democratic Republic had reorganized its economy following the model of the USSR. In 1951, its first five-year plan was launched, with the intention of doubling Germany's 1936 industrial output. By 1952, this aim was achieved in the production of iron, steel, and chemicals. Individual production targets were raised, and so were the prices of food and public transports. Politically, tension was increased by the arrest of non-communist politicians. Church leaders warned of a catastrophe, and many fled into the West, obviously because we had this open frontier. The GDR, or the German Democratic Republic, therefore had no human capital since most skilled workers left the East. So the crisis basically begins because a lot of people do not want to remain in a Soviet country. Failures in the German Democratic Republic embarrassed the Soviets. In May 1953, the Presidium of the Soviet Council of Ministers met to consider the problem. Beria, the head of the Soviet secret police, now called the KGB, began to reassess the value of the GDR to the Soviet bloc. It was expensive and unstable. They therefore argued for the reunification of the East and West of Germany. Ulbricht, the leader of the GDR, had other plans to keep himself in power. He believed that by continuing the strain to the East German economy and actually leading to an uprising within the country itself, would therefore not allow for unification to happen. So the German Prime Minister is pressured to the East German Prime Minister pressured to actually keep the situation tense, to keep the people unhappy, because if the people are unhappy, they're going to be allowing for him to stay in power in the East. He does not want the unification of Germany. So this is going to be leading to the East German uprising. This is going to be a series of strikes and riots that broke throughout East Germany on June 16, 1953. Workers demanded increased pay, more political freedom, and the re-establishment of the German Social Democratic Party, which had amalgamated with the KPD in 1946 to create the SED, the Unity Party. In East Berlin, 100,000 people demonstrated on the streets. They called for the resignation of the government. The government called the Soviets for help, and on June 17th, Soviet troops backed by tanks moved to suppress the uprising. Sporadic demonstrations and riots continued throughout the summer, with 125 people killed, 19 of them in East Berlin. What are going to be the consequences of German unity? The uprising is considered one of the most significant events in the history of the Cold War. It took both the Soviets and the Western Allies by surprise. The U.S. chose not to intervene, but hoped that it would pressure the West to take action. The U.S. would respond to pressure of public opinion in West Germany for intervention in East Germany by calling for a foreign ministers' conference on the future of Germany itself. At the same time, through provocative broadcasts from its radio stations in West Berlin, it would do all it could to prolong the unrest in East Germany. This policy certainly strengthened support for Adenauer in the Federal Republic of Germany, and he again won the election in that year. So the U.S. is taking a policy of non-intervention, but again, they are intervening through their free radio by increasing the tensions in the East and by manipulating the West into actually allowing for this capitalist liberal democracy to flourish. So now we are going to have the Berlin Conference from January 25th to February 18th, 1954. When the conference met, all hopes for German unification were over. Beria, a member of the Soviet government who had proposed unification, had been executed. Again, this was the chief of the secret police of the USSR. Both sides proposed contrasting plans, and nothing was reached yet again. The USSR feared that the Western proposal of holding free elections in Germany would lead to a massive anti-communist vote, while the Western powers feared that a neutral, disarmed Germany, not integrated into NATO or the European defense community, would be vulnerable to Soviet influence. So again, we're seeing the same tensions and the same issues over Germany. On May 5th, 1953, the EDC and the General Treaty were both ratified by the West German parliament, but the EDC was rejected by the French National Assembly in 1954. This reopened the whole question of German rearmament and the Federal Republic of Germany's entry into NATO. So again, this is going to be a key event in the history of the world, because we're going to have this specific section of Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, actually entering NATO in 1954. So the immediate priority of Britain and the US was to secure the FRG's entry into NATO. France's fears of a rearmed Germany were overcome by Adenauer's agreement to limit the West German army to the size envisaged in the EDC agreement and the FRG's renouncement of nuclear weapons. So the FRG can join NATO, they cannot have a large army, and they cannot have nuclear weapons. Until United Germany was created under Western control, the four powers would maintain their armies in the FRG and Berlin. This agreement solidified the entry of West Germany into NATO. Ultimately, the more the FRG was integrated into the West, the more tightly bound was the GDR into the Soviet bloc. This is a map of NATO, the Warsaw Pact states, the non-aligned states, and other communist states in 1955. So as you can see, we have this creation of the two blocs. We're going to have communist states that are not necessarily involved, like Tito in Yugoslavia, and we're also going to have all those non-aligned states that are going to be trying to create their own bloc. I mean, we call this the Third World. In 1955, the USSR and Eastern European states entered the Warsaw Pact. The GDR eventually joined in 1956. This pact committed its members to consult on issues of mutual interest and to give all necessary assistance in the event of an attack on any one of them in Europe. Essentially, the treaty was signed for political rather than military reasons as a response to the FRG's entry into NATO, but it still kept open the option of a neutral Germany by declaring that if a general European Treaty of Collective Security was signed, the Warsaw Pact would lapse. We've already talked about the Geneva Accords. We're going to be seeing this concept of the Geneva spirit rising. So in May 1956, Khrushchev and Bulganin, who had now emerged as the leaders of the USSR, accepted an invitation from the Western Allies to meet in Geneva, Switzerland. This would be the first major summit conference since Potsdam in 1945. When the leaders of Britain, France, the US, and the USSR met in July, they agreed on the following agenda. First, the reunification of Germany, European security disarmament, the development of contacts between East and West. The USSR agreed to evacuate Austria, which had been divided into 4 zones in 1945, provided it remained neutral and did not join NATO. There was, however, still deadlock between the two sides over the future of Germany. Adenauer is therefore going to be visiting Moscow in September 1955. Adenauer, again, is the minister of the Federal Republic of Germany. So in September 1955, Adenauer visited Moscow to negotiate the return of the last German prisoners of war and to establish normal diplomatic relations with the USSR. The Soviets, in turn, wanted to recognize the General Democratic Republic as an independent state. To ensure his political position, Adenauer announced the Hallstein Doctrine. This stated that the FRG would consider the recognition of the GDR by any state, other than the USSR, as an unfriendly act which would lead to an immediate break in diplomatic relations. The Hallstein Doctrine deepened the divisions between the two Germanys. So again, it's going to be called the Hallstein Doctrine. The two Germanys are going to be recognizing each other, but the West Germany is not necessarily going to be recognizing the claims of the USSR over East Germany. Now, second section of this presentation, the emergence of the third world and the non-aligned movement. I just mentioned it a little bit, but we're going to go in depth. Our guiding question is, why did the non-aligned movement cause difficulties for both the US and the USSR? Please take a screenshot of this diagram so that you can structure your notes accordingly. By 1955, European colonial empires were in retreat. In Asia, the Netherlands had been forced out of Indonesia, France out of Indochina, and Britain out of India, Burma, and Sri Lanka. In North Africa, France was under pressure to pull out of Algeria and Britain to relinquish treaty rights in Egypt. In early 1950s, the concept of the third world began to emerge to describe the global majority who claimed to have been economically depressed and enslaved by colonial powers. The Third World was composed of developing states, many of which had been colonies or under the control of predominantly European states, but that chose to remain neutral during the Cold War. Here we have a map of the First World, the Second World, and the Third World. Please note, it is incredibly important to not account the Third World as an underdeveloped bloc, because these are divisions that were used during the Cold War, and we do not use these divisions anymore. We're not looking at non-aligned countries anymore. We're looking at developing countries, countries that are underdeveloped, or countries that are developed already, core, periphery, and semi-periphery nations. So please do not use third world to describe countries that are underdeveloped or developing. Under the new Soviet leadership, Khrushchev realized that the USSR could exploit anti-colonialism to weaken the West. In December 1955, Khrushchev and Bulganin, during a tour of India, Burma, and Afghanistan, stressed Soviets' willingness to cooperate with the Third World, claiming that the main enemy was colonialism and imperialism. We saw this in the spread of communism in Asia, where they used an anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism dialogue to actually entice the people of Asia to fight against the US and to fight against Britain and France. The years 1954 and 1955 were also a period of cooperation between the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. In 1954, the USSR signed a series of agreements with the PRC. It agreed to return military bases in Lushan, also known as Port Arthur, that had been occupied at the end of the Second World War, to increase financial and technical support, and later to supply the PRC with nuclear technology. Again, we're going to be seeing all this propaganda that showcases the really tight friendship that the two countries had between each other. Now, this is incredibly important to the foundation of the Third World. We're going to be talking about the Bandung Conference. The leaders of 5 independent Asian states, Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Burma, and Sri Lanka, planned to meet in Bandung in 1955. They also invited the leaders of independence movements in Africa, Asia, and South America, and China tagged along. Around 1.5 billion people were represented. The main topic, however, was the completion of the struggle for liberation from the Western world. In the final communique, emphasis was placed on the importance of economic and cultural cooperation among third world states. It was recommended that a joint policy regarding petroleum be created. This led to the creation of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, also known as the OPEC, in 1960. It also called on the states to abstain from the use of arrangements of collective defense to serve the particular interests of any of the big powers. So again, we're going to see the creation of this Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. In English, it's called the OPEC. In Spanish, it's called the OPEP. But yeah, this organization is basically going to be allowing us to form this third world bloc. It's going to be allowing us to, all these developing countries, it's going to be allowing them to be able to consolidate their economies and actually be a huge part of the economy by exporting their petroleum, which is a key commodity in the world. In 1961, India, Indonesia, Egypt, Yugoslavia, Ghana, and Algeria met in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, and established the Non-Aligned Movement, or the NAM, based on the principles of self-determination, mutual economic assistance, and neutrality, which had been agreed upon in Bandung. To emphasize their neutrality in the Cold War, all the heads of state of the participating countries at the conference sent identical notes to Khrushchev and US President Kennedy, warning against the threat of war and appealing for a peaceful conclusion to the Berlin crisis. By 1964, there were around 50 members in the non-aligned movement. The next section of this presentation is 1956, the year of crises. We're going to be looking at two of the main crises in the war, which I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. We're going to go in depth in the case of Egypt and in the case of Hungary. Our guiding question is, what caused a series of crises that shook both Western powers and the Soviet bloc in 1956? Please take a screenshot of this slide so that we can organize your notes and that you know how this presentation is going to be structured. So the first concept that we have to talk about when dealing with this crisis is going to be desalinization. The year 1956 was a pivotal year in the Cold War since the USSR had to question their role and control over Eastern Europe. Desalinization strongly affected the relations between the USSR and its satellite states. It appeared to promise a return to the policy of different roads to socialism, which Stalin briefly tolerated between 1945 and 1947. With the execution of Beria and the dissolvement of his secret police networks, there was hope of more independence in satellite states. Khrushchev is going to be giving a speech in February 1956, and this is going to be imposing this ideology of desalinization. So a further wave of desalinization followed Khrushchev's famous speech at the 20th Party Conference of the Communist Party. He denounced Stalin and recognized the right of the satellite states to find their own ways to socialism. Although the speech was supposed to be secret, the Central Intelligence Agency of the US government acquired a copy and ensured that it was broadcast by radio to Eastern Europe. Expectations of reform were further increased by the improvement in relations between the USSR and Yugoslavia, which was readmitted to the Soviet bloc after Khrushchev and Bulganin, the Soviet prime minister, visited Belgrade in May 1955. The blame for the break in 1948 was attributed to Stalin. Tito, the Yugoslav leader, ambitiously believed that as a result of his experience in defying Stalin, he was a role model for the new generation of Soviet bloc leaders and would now be their leader. The idea of different forms of communism started to proliferate across Europe. This is going to be leading to the Polish crisis in June through October of 1956. The new doctrine's limitations were first tested in Poland in 1956. At the end of June, riots broke out in Poznan when the local factory workers protested about the imposition of increased product targets. These were suppressed with heavy casualties by the police, but to mitigate criticism of the government, the Polish Workers' Party, Poland's local communist party, recalled Gomulka, who had been recently released from prison, to lead the government as first secretary. So again, this is going to be this key figure, Gomulka, who's going to be now leading, he's going to be integrated into the Polish government again. The Soviets, fearing Polish independence, sent the Red Army, but Gomulka resisted Soviet forces and his election went ahead. This is also going to be impacting the situation in Hungary. So we're going to see the Hungarian Uprising of 1956. As part of his desalinization campaign, Khrushchev had, with Tito's backing, pressured the Hungarian Communist Party in July 1956 to replace its old-style Stalinist leader, Matthias Rákosi, with a more liberal Erno Gero. Tito had considerable ambitions in Hungary, as he hoped that an independent communist regime would emerge and that would allow Yugoslavia to take control of the region, rather than Khrushchev and the USSR. On October 23, 1956, there was a large demonstration in Budapest, Hungary's capital, Protesters demanded the withdrawal of Soviet troops and a new government under Imre Nagy. They didn't like Gero. Nagy was an independent-minded communist who advocated reforms similar to those Tito had introduced in Yugoslavia. Gero's response was to appoint Nagy prime minister. In response to these demonstrations, the USSR initially mobilized 30,000 troops backed with tanks and artillery. However, Khrushchev had other plans. On October 30th, he issued a declaration on the principles of development and further strengthening of the friendship and cooperation between the USSR and other socialist countries. This attempted to provide a legal and mutual agreement framework for Soviet military bases in East Europe, so this was similar to the Warsaw Pact. Hungary, however, announced its intention to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact itself. If this happened, others would follow. Major fighting between Hungarian and Soviet troops erupted in the countryside in northwest Hungary, and by October 28th, the rebels were in control of most of Hungary outside Budapest. So the Hungarians are successfully rebelling, and they're going to be able to break free from the USSR and establish their own communist reforms. The U.S. policy is obviously going to be one where they're going to be trying to stop communism, but not outrightly do so. So the U.S. Radio Free Europe, a radio station sponsored by the U.S. government to broadcast anti-Soviet and pro-U.S. propaganda, encouraged Hungarians to revolt. They were led to believe that NATO would intervene to provide protection from the USSR. Fearful, Eisenhower, however, did not want to risk war with the USSR and had thus announced publicly on October 27 that the US had no ulterior purpose in desiring the independence of the satellite countries and would not look upon these nations as potential military allies. So yes, they're going to be overtly spreading propaganda in favor of the West through the Radio Free Europe station, but publicly they're going to be taking a stance where they're non-intervening whatsoever, again because of this policy of Detente. On November 4th, Soviet troops advanced into Hungary, and after a few days of fierce fighting with the Hungarian rebels, a new government loyal to the USSR under János Kádár was installed. So the West is not going to win, even though they're asking for communist reforms. The USSR is still going to be intervening by sending their military into Hungary and installing a new government. So ultimately, Hungary is going to be defeated in 1956. The second crisis that we're going to talk about is the Suez Crisis. Basically, Soviet policy during the Hungarian Uprising cannot be fully understood without also reviewing the Suez Crisis of October 1956. In here, we see a map of the Suez Canal, which is located in Egypt. Nasser, who became the president of Egypt in 1954, embodied the new independent anti-colonialist spirit of the Bandung Conference. His main aim was to force European colonial powers out of the Middle East and North Africa and to return the Palestinian refugees to their homeland in what had become Israel in 1948. Again, it's important to note that the history of Israel is pretty recent. Israel was created by Britain and France in 1948 to actually mitigate the efforts of the Germans and to actually gain control of the Middle East through that region. Throughout the Middle East, the Cairo radio station, Voice of the Arabs, encouraged resistance to pro-British and pro-French governments in the region. So this is why we have that tension, because the British and the French are intervening in a region that they don't really understand and that they don't really have any say in politics whatsoever, although they can intervene through the creation of Israel itself. The U.S. was willing to supply weapons to Egypt as long as they were to be used only for defensive purposes and accompanied by U.S. military personnel for supervision and training. Nasser rejected these conditions as he feared that they would tie Egypt too tightly to the U.S. and instead looked to the Soviet bloc for weapon supplies. On September 27, 1955, Nasser announced an arms deal with Czechoslovakia. Under the terms of this deal, Egypt received considerable quantities of fighter and bomber aircraft tanks. Alarmed by the arms deal, Britain and the US sought to improve relations with Egypt. They agreed in December 1955, together with the World Bank, to raise $270 million towards the cost of the initial statements of the construction of the Aswan High Dam, to improve irrigation in the Nile Valley and develop hydroelectricity. Egypt also explored Soviet offers to build a dam more cheaply, as it resented the financial guarantees demanded by the World Bank, which it argued amounted to control of the Egyptian economy. So we see this clash of dependency in regards to the economy of the World Bank and the economy of a developing state like Egypt. In June 1956, the USSR offered Nasser a massive loan of almost $1 billion at 2% interest for the construction of the dam. Stressed out, the US and Britain canceled their offer. Here, just a reminder, the Egyptian-Czechoslovak arms deal is going to be key for the creation of this dam, and later on it's going to be arming all these Egyptian armies to fight for their Suez Canal. There are several other reasons why the US decided to withdraw the offer of funding and not match the Soviet offer. The first is that Egypt regarded itself as still at war with Israel, an ally of the US. Nasser undermined pro-Western governments in Turkey, Iran, and Iraq. Nasser recognized the PRC, the People's Republic of China. U.S. Secretary of State Dulles believed that the Soviet Union would not be able to fulfill its commitment to build a dam, and that in time Nasser would become disillusioned with the USSR and turn again to the U.S. Gaining control of the Suez Canal was a major aim of Nasser and Egyptian nationalists. The canal was owned by an Anglo-French company, and Britain controlled a series of military bases along its shores. In 1954, Nasser and the British government negotiated an agreement whereby British troops would evacuate their bases along the canal, leaving the canal's operation to British and Egyptian technicians. In the event of an attack on Egypt, Britain would have the right to return to protect the canal. On July 26th, he nationalized the canal so that he could use its revenues, which were raised from the tolls charged to ships using the canal, to finance the construction of the Aswan High Dam. So slowly but surely, Nasser is going to be nationalizing the country, obviously using this communist background to become more independent from the West. And he's going to be nationalizing the canal in order to finance that Aswan High Dam, which is going to be benefiting the country extremely in an exponential manner, right? As a response to this, the Anglo-French coalition with Israel is going to be formed. The nationalization of the Suez Canal gave Britain, France, and Israel an excuse to topple Nasser. All three states wanted to remove him from power. For the British and French, he was a determined enemy, especially of the remaining colonial influence they had in North Africa and the Middle East. For Israelis, Nasser represented a dangerous threat, as he was intent on ending what he saw as a European Zionist occupation of Palestine, which is also the new state of Israel. And to strengthen itself, Israel wished to gain control of more territory, specifically Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, because obviously in the Old Testament, the Sinai Peninsula was a really key part of both the Jewish and the Christian religion. On October 16th, Britain, France, and Israel created a joint plan for invading Egypt. Israeli troops would invade Egypt through the Sinai and advance towards the canal. Britain and France would intervene in the conflict between Israel and Egypt by sending a force of troops to protect the canal, using the 1954 Anglo-Egyptian Agreement to justify their action. When Israel attacked on October 29th, Britain and France immediately demanded withdrawal of both the Israeli and Egyptian forces from the canal, although Egypt had not been the aggressor and had lost control of most of the Sinai. When Nasser refused, British planes bombed Egypt's airfields, leaving them basically useless for the Egyptian army. On November 5th, Anglo-French forces landed along the Suez Canal. Britain assumed that they would obtain U.S. support, but Eisenhower, in the middle of an election campaign, refused to give it. The U.S. viewed the Suez conflict as an attempt by Britain and France to prop up their disintegrated empires in the Middle East and North Africa. Not only did the U.S. condemn the attack in the United Nations, but through massive diplomatic and financial pressure on both Britain and France, Eisenhower managed to halt the fighting on November 6th, when British and French troops had almost completed capturing the whole canal. U.S. pressure forced Israel to leave the Sinai Peninsula in March 1957. Khrushchev cleverly exploited this split in NATO, and on November 5th, threatened nuclear missile attacks on Britain, France, and Israel if they did not stop their attack on Egypt. Although it was known by the CIA that the USSR did not yet possess the missiles to propel such warheads, the ceasefire on the following day made it appear as if it was the Soviet ultimatum rather than US pressure that saved Egypt. So again, because of the selfishness of the British and the French, and ultimately the survival of the Israelis, we're going to have this war break across the Suez Canal. The French and the British want to maintain their colonies. They're going to do so by gaining more power through Israel. The Israelis are really, really sore from World War II. Obviously, these are all the Jewish people that had been able to flee from the war and be able to settle in Israel, a state that is newly created. The Palestinians are completely gone from that state because the British, the French, and the Israelis have pushed them from their lands and have sent them down to Egypt. And Egypt is kind of pissed off. I mean, Egypt just wants their territory. They want what is theirs because, I mean, the Suez Canal is a part of the Egyptian territory, and they do not want any interference in terms of Israeli forces. Obviously, they specifically do not want any interference from the British or the French because the British used to have this colonial power over Egypt. Now, for section 4 of this presentation, the aftermath of the Hungarian and Suez Crisis, 1957 to 1958. Again, the guiding question is going to be, what were the consequences of the crisis of 1956 for the Soviet bloc and the Western powers? Please take a screenshot of this, add it to your notes, because this is how this section of the presentation is structured. Basically, U.S. intervention in Egypt showed that its interests and its allies' interests could sometimes diverge. And when that happened, the U.S. likely, like any other power, would ruthlessly pursue what it perceived to be its own advantage. In the Soviet bloc, the crushing of the Hungarian Uprising indicated that the USSR would use force to maintain its position in Eastern Europe. Crises in Poland and Hungary had shown how difficult it was for the USSR to encourage the satellite states to reform without creating a demand for their transformation in genuine democratic regimes. This is going to be leading to the Moscow Conference of International Communist Leaders in October 1957. Khrushchev attempted to remedy this conflict at the conference, attended by international communist leaders at Moscow in October 1957 to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. Although opposed by Poland and Yugoslavia, this conference passed a motion recognizing the USSR as the first and mightiest of socialist countries, while acknowledging the legitimacy of the principle of different roads to socialism. All must follow the Soviet model. This doctrine led to a fresh break with Tito, who now joined with India, Egypt, Indonesia, and Ghana to form the non-aligned movement of neutral states in 1961. We're going to see growing criticism from the PRC. Outwardly, relations between Mao and Khrushchev were friendly. At the conference, Mao called on the communist world to recognize the leadership of the USSR. However, Mao was also highly critical of the whole de-Stalinization process and the way Khrushchev had handled the crises in Poland and Hungary. Mao claimed that he was Stalin's successor and not Khrushchev. One of the important legacies of the Hungarian and Suez Crisis was that Khrushchev's position was greatly strengthened in the USSR. In 1958, he became the Soviet Prime Minister as well as remaining First Secretary of the party. After his propaganda success in the Suez Crisis, Khrushchev was convinced that the mere threat of nuclear weapons would enable him to force NATO to make concessions over the status of Berlin. His policy of nuclear diplomacy gained more credibility when the USSR launched the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, also known as an ICBM, in August 1957, and followed it by sending satellite Sputnik into orbit in October. Although these were impressive achievements, it was not until 1960 that the USSR had 4 ICBMs equipped with nuclear warheads. Meanwhile, the US was developing Polaris submarines. By 1962, 8 of these submarines were at sea and were able to fire 144 nuclear missiles. NATO in 1957 is going to have a lot of issues. The Suez Crisis weakened NATO by causing profound disagreements between the 3 leading NATO powers, the US, Britain, and France. Obviously, at this point, everybody's doing whatever they can to protect their own interests. For Britain, close relations between themselves and the US were reestablished. They agreed to base 60 intermediate-range ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads in Britain and place them under joint US-British control. In 1958, both powers cooperated to support the pro-Western regimes in Lebanon and Jordan against subversion directed by the Egypt-dominated United Arab Republic that was temporarily formed in 1958 between Egypt and Syria. France reacted to the failure of the Suez War by seeking to make itself both militarily and economically independent of the US. To achieve this, Charles de Gaulle, who became president in June 1958, was determined that France would develop its own nuclear weapons and, through close cooperation with the FRG, make the newly created European Economic Community, or EEC, independent of the US. We're seeing the beginning of this European Union. In the Federal Republic of Germany, Chancellor Adenauer did not share de Gaulle's vision of the future of the EEC. He wanted it to develop into a closely integrated community linked to the US, obviously in support of this capitalist neoliberal economy. So we're seeing this European Economic Community being created, established by the Treaty of Rome, which was signed by the FRG, France, Italy, and the Benelux states in 1957. Its aim was to create a common market or customs union within 12 years, while also gradually forming a more integrated political structure. So we're going to be seeing, from this, we're going to be seeing the development of a European Free Trade Association, also called the EFTA. British plans for the creation of a much larger free trade zone were turned down by the leaders of the 6 powers on the grounds that it would not provide an effective basis for European economic and political cooperation. This led Britain forming an alternative, the European Free Trade Association, with Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, Austria, and Portugal. So we're seeing different economic associations. We're going to be seeing different free trade agreements. Ultimately, a combination of all of them are going to be forming what we know as the European Union later on. But right now, we're seeing those different blocs with different neoliberal policies in the West, and obviously all those Eastern blocs with communist policies. Now, for the last section of this presentation, we're going to cover the Berlin Crisis from 1958 to 1961. Our guiding question is, to what extent did the Soviet Union achieve its objectives during the Berlin Crisis of 1958 to 1961? By 1958, it was clear that the Soviet aim of creating a neutral, disarmed, and united Germany had failed. Not only was the Federal Republic of Germany a member of NATO, but NATO had also decided to equip the FRG's army with tactical nuclear weapons. The priority of the USSR was now to strengthen the German Democratic Republic. Again, please take a screenshot of this diagram so that you can structure your notes. This basically explains a summary of the Berlin Crisis. The German Democratic Republic depended directly on the USSR. It lacked national identity and was confronted with a much better Western Germany. NATO states refused to acknowledge the legal existence of the GDR. They argued that its government had not been democratically elected and that it was not an independent country, but still the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany. If the USSR were to close the frontier between West and East Berlin, it would be acting both unilaterally and illegally, and therefore trigger a major crisis with NATO, because legally it was still under 4-power control. Here we see some images of life in East Berlin. Through the open frontier in Berlin, it was still possible to flee from a stagnant economy and an oppressive state, and rationing to the successful capitalistic and democratic FRG. Between 1945 and 1961, about 1/6 of the whole GDR population fled to the FRG. Again, it's 1/6 of the population that is fleeing East Germany to be a part of the West. By grossly exaggerating the extent of Soviet nuclear power and by putting pressure on West Berlin, Khrushchev was sure that he could force Britain, France, and the US to withdraw from West Berlin, recognize legal existence of the GDR, recognize the East's right to control Berlin's borders, agree to a peace treaty with Germany, which would recognize the division of Germany and the GDR's post-war frontiers with Poland, and ultimately it's going to be allowing Khrushchev to call control over the situation, the overall crisis. This is going to be leading to the actual Berlin crisis. The crisis began on November 10th when Khrushchev called for a peace treaty with the two German states. Khrushchev's ultimatum demanded the demilitarization of West Berlin, the withdrawal of Western troops, and its change of status into a free city. If the Western Allies refused to sign the peace treaty with the two German states, Khrushchev threatened to conclude a peace agreement just with the GDR and to recognize its sovereignty over East Berlin. He therefore attempted to shatter the Hallstein Doctrine in order to have this recognition of East Berlin by other states. Western reaction in 1959 is going to be key for this development. Although the Western Allies rejected the ultimatum, Khrushchev was successful in forcing them to the conference table to discuss the problem of Germany. In Geneva, again, we're talking about the Geneva Accords, both sides put forward proposals for German unity, but no agreement was secured. The Western Allies presented their usual demand for free elections, while the USSR suggested that the two Germanys form a confederation that would slowly evolve into a united state. Khrushchev's actions were not without success. Behind the scenes in Britain and the US, and at times even in France, various schemes for creating a nuclear-free zone in Central Europe and legally recognizing Poland's western frontiers and the GDR were considered. The leader was clever. He used the shooting down of a US spy plane over the USSR as an excuse to cancel the summit and wait until a new US president was elected later that year. Let's talk about the U-2 spy plane and the arms race. In 1956, the US bought 53 Lockheed U-2 spy planes. Based in Japan, Turkey, and Britain, they were able to fly over Soviet territory and photograph military bases, missile factories, and launch pads. By 1961, Soviet technology caught up with the U-2s, and on May 5th, a Soviet anti-aircraft missile shot down a plane that had been sent to see whether there were missile bases in the Ural Mountains. This flight established that, for all Khrushchev's boasting, the Soviets possessed very few ICBMs and no launching platforms. Indeed, the USSR had only 4 ICBMs based on a site near Archangel. So basically, the U-2 crisis actually allowed the US to take bigger strides towards the Cold War because it showed that the USSR did not have the same development that the US had. It was still kind of like a slap in the face for the US because they shut down a plane and it was international news. Kennedy indicated that the US and NATO would fight to preserve the freedom of the West, especially in West Berlin, but would not intervene to stop the GDR from closing the frontier between the East and the West of Berlin. The economic crisis in the German Democratic Republic led to Khrushchev to establish the wall. In April 1960, the remaining independent farmers were forced into collective farms. The immediate economic impact of this was disastrous. Crop yields plummeted, and within months there were serious shortages of bread, butter, and meat. This led to an even increasing number of people fleeing to West Germany. The Soviet leader took a decision. In 1961, the border was sealed with barbed wire, and when no Western countermeasures followed, a more permanent concrete wall was built. With the construction of the Berlin Wall, he achieved a limited but important success for Soviet policies. The existence of the German Democratic Republic was now assured, and ultimately the Federal Republic of Germany would be forced to drop the Hallstein Doctrine and recognize its independence. By tolerating the wall, the Western powers in effect recognized East Germany. We finish our presentation with a bibliography. Thanks to the Huller publication of the Cold War, and we recognize the authors of all visual and auditory content in this presentation. Thank you for listening.